Now we move to the second letter of the blessed rhythms, L, which stands for listen or listen and engage. As Jesus followers, we must learn to follow Jesus in his practices of listening. He was so good at this, and he still is. And we must learn to live with the same posture of being a learner and a listener like Jesus. Quite often, you'll see that Jesus doesn't come into a conversation with an idea of what he should do first. Rather, he seeks to understand the people and the place, and then he responds. Take blind Bartimaeus, for example. The man was shouting for Jesus to come and help him. Even when the crowds are trying to get him to be quiet, he's still shouting, "Son of David, have mercy on me." When Jesus comes over, he doesn't immediately heal the man. What does he do? He asks a question. What do you want me to do for you? While the answer seems obvious, Jesus didn't assume. When we search the gospel narratives, we find that Jesus asked over 300 questions. Again, Jesus takes the posture of a learner and a listener. He's actually curious. This is the posture of a good missionary that they're willing to embrace, rather than the posture that says, well, I know what is wrong and I know what they need. In this following video, Darryl Answer will explore this idea further, sharing how his community has taken on a posture of listening, and then asking us to consider how we might listen and then contextualize an idea where we live, work, learn, and play.
I have a question for you. When you think about mission, how often do you connect that with listening? Many times when we think about mission, we think about activity, we think about what we're going to do, we think about conversations that we need to have, we think about the work that needs to be done to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. But how often do we think about mission and listening? Repeatedly in the Gospels, we find Jesus challenging his disciples to see beyond their current social order and inviting them to join him in his kingdom. And one of the ways Jesus would do that is he would say, those who have an ear to hear, let them hear. It's almost like we're learning that to be a disciple, to be a follower of Jesus, means we learn to listen with new intention. See, the thing is, we take the time to listen to God. We also take the time to listen to others in community. You could go as far as saying our actions as followers of Jesus are shaped by what, how, and who we listen to. So in the short time I have, I want to share with you what I am learning about listening within the context of mission. So I have the privilege to serve and train others within communities that are labeled as low income or disadvantaged, places that are recognized by its needs, which leaves room for assumption that nothing good can come from this place. But the more I think about that, the more I'm like, well, that's okay, because that's what people thought about Jesus' community, right? There is an amazing theologian, pastor, professor, no longer with us, but he's with Jesus. His name is Howard Thurman. And in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, he wrote this amazing phrase. He said, it cannot be denied that too often the weight of the Christian movement has been on the side of the strong and the powerful and against the weak and oppressed. This despite the gospel. Now, this quote from Howard Thurman in his incredible book, Jesus and the Disinherited, this speaks to power. And it also speaks to who is recognized to be the bearer of good news. Now, here's the thing. It's unfortunate. It's so unfortunate that we found ourselves in a time when power and privilege also equate to the right to be heard. And the opposite is true for those who Thurman calls the weak, the oppressed, and what he also calls those whose backs are against the wall. So if you're listening to this and you're a missional leader, you're a disciple maker, I want to encourage you that it's important to create alternatives. We have to create alternatives that are different than this current social order that we're living in. This current order, the way that society is set up in such a way that gives preference to the powerful and only sees the poor through this lens of their need. We spend so much time listening to the words of those who lead large ministries and they have credentials, and we don't fault them for that. But do you hear the words of those who have little money or no social power? The question of Jesus is true for us today. Do you have ears to hear them? So in New Community, it's a network of spiritual families that I co-lead. We've attempted to create an alternative where we want to counter this narrative, right, and create an environment where we're able to cultivate an ear to hear, right? So a number of years ago, we launched an initiative that we call Eastside University. And in Eastside University, we do three main things. We discover, we connect, and we celebrate. I just want to take the next few minutes to share with you what each of those phases look like. So again, discovery. So when we started this a few years ago, it was just an idea. Again, we try and experiment with things. So my idea was to gather a few kids and train them to go out in the neighborhood and interview people. At first, I created questions for the kids. We'd go and I would knock on doors and kind of speak for the kids, and quickly discovered that I wasn't practicing what I was preaching. I was talking about listening, but I didn't begin that way. I didn't have the right posture. And so what we did was we made a shift. And so what started with 2 kids quickly grew to about 25 kids meeting in my home, nonetheless. And each week we met, and over time, these kids created their own interview questions. They wanted to figure out what the community knew. So these kids, these 25 kids, named themselves the Game Changers. That's what they named themselves. And they created these incredible questions that they then went out and asked folks in the neighborhood. And here are the questions. The first question is, tell us your name, or can we have your name? The second question is, how long have you lived in the neighborhood? The third question is, what is your favorite thing about the neighborhood? The fourth question is, what would you like to see in the neighborhood? Then it says, what would you like to learn? What can you teach? Do you have any words of wisdom for us? Can we keep in touch? And then finally, can we take a picture with you? Now, again, these are questions that the kids, the Game Changers, came up with. And these kids are aged 8 to 17. And again, 25 of these kids would gather week to week in my home, designing questions, going out into the neighborhood, coming back, sharing all that they had discovered and learned, right? And it was a beautiful time. And I remember one Saturday I was sitting on my front porch and a friend came to my house, and he was so excited about a conversation that he had just had with a group of kids. And he told me that the conversation that he had with those kids helped him to recognize that he was somebody, helped him to recognize that he had something to contribute to the community. And again, this is a community where many times people come in and what they focus on is what's wrong, what's broken, what the needs are, what the deficits are. But again, there are a group of kids walking through the neighborhood, getting the attention of other people, and what they're doing is discovering the gifts of their neighbors. So just beautiful stories came out of this as we took the time to discover. The next thing that we did was connect. Connection. The connection phase is a time where we invite people to share their gifts with the rest of the community. Now, our community is forgotten, right? Or is only recognized for what's wrong. But what we learn through our discovery phase is that we have teachers, we have entrepreneurs, we have poets, we have authors, we have mechanics, we have gardeners, we have architects, right? We have so many gifts, and these folks are sitting and they're waiting to be asked to share what God has given to them. So through our connection phase, we are continuing to listen and then invite people to share what God has given them, to share the gifts that God has put inside of them, to share the skills that they have gained over time. So it's almost like an opportunity, it's an exercise in community listening, where we come together and people are able to share what they have learned. And then we celebrate. And we love to celebrate with good food and conversation and music. And at the end of the summer, what we do is we gather the game changers, their families, all the folks that they interviewed, and we celebrate everything that was discovered. We have conversations and we do interviews. So we celebrate. There's the big celebration, but what we've also learned is that we also have to celebrate along the way. We have to be paying attention to the decisions, good decisions that are made by our kids, right? And connections that are made in the community. And so we celebrate along the way. So again, those three things that we have done as Eastside University that our game changers, our 8 to 17-year-olds have taught us is that we discover the gifts of neighbors. We go out and we ask these significant questions that have nothing to do with the needs. Nothing to do with the needs. I have a good friend that talks about the only need that we talk about is that people have the need to be needed, right? That there's a need that people have to be able to have purpose and to contribute in society. So that's what our discovery phase is about. Then connection, connecting people, right? And then celebration. So question for you is, what does this look like for you in your context? What does it look like for you to cultivate an environment where those who are considered weak and oppressed, they are heard and they are celebrated? See, how do we move beyond our current forms of church and mission, where it's usually the powerful, the privileged, the credentialed, where they have the platforms, but the very ones who Jesus spoke of in his Sermon on the Mount are seen and honored because Jesus says theirs is the kingdom? How do we move to that point? How do we change those paradigms? How do we take that time to listen not only to God, not only to those who are in our community, but also moving beyond that, to listening to those who, Howard Thurman said, whose backs are against the walls, the weak, the powerless. May we, as Jesus said to his disciples so many years ago and says to us today, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. Amen.